Welcome to the Guaranteed Analysis. And this week's episode, we have a very special guest, and her name is Mikaela. And she, if you've seen her on social media, has Nibble Nutrition and has a very evidence-based scientific background in nutrition. And we're so excited to have her here. And thank you so much, Mikaela, for being
Yeah.
here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Would you fill our listeners in on your background and kind of what led you to where you are now? Take us on
Yeah.
that journey.
Okay. So actually growing up, I always wanted to be a veterinarian, which I feel like a lot of people who end up in probably the nutrition industry probably want to be, surprisingly. And then, so I ended up doing a Bachelor of Science at Western University in Ontario, and it focused mostly on biology. And so I had to take like a lot of actually animal physiology courses, and then I was introduced to like like this nutrition through this. It was kind of like a weird way that I got there. It was through a thermal physiology course where I had to do a paper on um, the effects of food on body temperature. And so I was like, oh, like, maybe this is something that I actually want to do, like the effects of what they were eating on how the metabolic rate was causing increases in body temperature and stuff. So then I applied to do a master's degree the next year at the University of Guelph. And then I realized, like, actually, I think this is what I want to do instead of jumping right into vet school or anything. So yeah, it was a lot of fun. It was pretty course heavy, the master's program that I did. So I got to take a lot of really interesting courses, like advanced animal nutrition, and then a course that was comparative animal nutrition, where we talked about like wildlife or exotic animals and compared it to like domesticated animals, which was really pretty awesome. And then just courses just about the methodology and stuff, and got to work with like a lot of amazing, really smart people. So it was fun. Yeah. Yeah. And then I decided to start Nibble Nutrition because I saw like all my friends who have dogs, the kind of influence that they were getting because they're asking me a lot of questions off of what they're seeing like online. And I had to keep saying like, well, no, that's not really, how it necessarily goes, or that's not true. So then I figured that I'd start Nibble Nutrition just to kind of get out there and have an evidence-based approach, but also like a non-biased approach. So I'm not really like married to any brand or any specific way of life. So yeah, it's kind of what led me to here.
Yeah, and your content is just chef's kiss beautiful. And
Thank you.
we were talking a little bit before a recent one that and I don't know if people realize how much time it takes to create content
No, yeah.
for social media. Just even those like, what are they called? The carousels where you put
Yes.
the information on there and you have to get very comfortable with software like Canva
Yes. Yeah.
and Meta itself and Instagram is not easy and user friendly to post on. Often
No.
once you post it, you can't take it down. It's like trying to edit a spelling
I
error or typo
know.
is just
Oh
so
yeah.
hard.
Yeah, I
Yeah. And
realized that
so,
after, like, sometimes you get so into it, like the last post that I made, I was like really like kind of heated about it. And I posted it so quickly, and then I was like, oh, I've made like a typo, and then you can't fix it. And I was like, that's kind of frustrating, but the message is still out there, so I was like, okay, people will understand anyways. So yeah.
yes. And then also taking the time, which you do, I would say most of your content, you cite it, which I don't always I don't, take the time to like put all of the references in there
Hmm.
and cite everything. You
Yeah.
do. And that is amazing so that people
Oh
can
yeah.
go
Yeah.
and
I try,
that's
yeah.
they,
I
but that's also something that I'd love to get your thoughts on is
mhm.
we should do that, right? And that's important to have what we put
Mhm.
out there be, referenced. But at the same
Mhm.
time, your average pet guardian really doesn't have the skill set to
Yeah.
go to PubMed and pull that study and be able to interpret it accurately.
Yeah. Yeah, I mostly post it just so I think it's more so for other like academics or like experts in the field, and then or even just pet parents that maybe have a scientific background if
Hmm.
they're interested. And I think it's also maybe just been drilled into me from so much
Yeah.
school
Yeah.
where it's like you have to cite your
Source,
sources,
source,
or yeah,
source. Yeah.
I think maybe that's what it is. But yeah, I've never had anybody reach out and be like, well, I read this paper, but it would be interesting to see if actually like anybody did go. But yeah,
Go
I
and
think it's
find it and read it.
yeah, I talk about this a lot with my friends because actually a lot of my friends are doing PhDs or they've done their masters or they're in med school now, and it's they how like their family also doesn't really know how to read these kind of papers, and people just assume when something's published that it's like that's the truth or like that's 100% valid science. And I have to constantly explain to people, like, I'm like, if you search hard enough, you're going to find evidence for anything and everything. Like, you can scrape the bottom of the barrel and just find something that's going to support your, whatever you want, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's good science. And that's something that you kind of learn throughout undergrad or professional school or like graduate school, is like how to actually figure out what is good and valid science and stuff. And yeah, I wish that more people were aware of that. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do a bit, post about that every once in a while. So yeah.
Yes, absolutely. This idea now of resource, I call it research washing, where
Mhm.
it's kind of like hot and trendy for someone to like green screen a study or something
Oh,
behind them, but then they're not interpreting the study correctly,
no.
or they're overstating the findings. That's something that's really easy to do. And that's why we
Hmm.
have a greater scientific consensus, right? Is
Yeah.
because someone's interpretation of data
Hmm.
may be different than somebody else's. And that's why we have the peer
Yeah.
review process and the greater scientific consensus. And so this idea where people just grab a study and just because they have a study to throw up there, especially if
Yeah.
they don't have a scientific background, if they don't have a master's degree, if they
Oh
don't have a
yeah.
PhD. And I actually
Yeah.
see this a lot with some fellow veterinarians. I don't mean to throw anybody under the bus, but I do think that certain veterinary curriculums don't emphasize enough. I don't
Hmm.
know that they emphasize the scientific process, but like how to really break apart
Oh
a
yeah.
study. This I think
Yeah.
is absolutely done in um, specialty training. So if
Yeah.
internal medicine and surgery and nutrition, you sit down, you have journal club, you rip apart a study,
Yeah.
you talk about who funded it and what their statistics were, and was it, were their
Hmm.
findings, did they overstate their findings? Do we agree with this? And so you really learn how to do that. But in
Hmm.
just in vet school,
Nothing.
that doesn't
Yeah.
really happen. So I
Yeah.
unfortunately see a lot of colleagues even throwing up a study and saying like, oh, well, there's evidence to back this up. And it's like, this study was
Well,
terrible. Like they
yeah.
didn't have enough controls or their stats were all wrong. Or so it's
Hmm.
not enough to redact it. To redact
Yeah.
means like say like, oh, just kidding. The study was so bad. We're pulling it out of the greater
Yeah.
scientific literature.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
it may not be so egregious or bad that it needs to be redacted, but
No.
it's also like you can't state that from this study.
No,
Like you
but it's
can't.
still out there, and sometimes it takes them so long too. Like recently, I've seen if they need to redact a study, it'll take so long for it to actually get done, and it'll be out there
Yeah.
forever. And it's like, oh no,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. You mentioned Journal Club, and I found that that was really, really helpful. Like I had to do, in like seminars in undergrad, like the upper levels, and then in my master's program, I was really lucky to be in a lab where we did journal club during lab meetings. And then
Hmm.
one course that I took was essentially we had to do 3 journal clubs where it was like you had to find a paper that was relevant to what you're studying and then talk about it. And then you actually got to talk about it with like your peers, and then the professor would weigh in quite a lot. So that I think is like the most helpful way for people to kind of learn how to engage, like critically engage with literature, is like through journal club. And I understand why it's not, popular, but I wish that, it would be almost more like, I don't, I'm not sure. I just wish it was more common, I guess. Yeah.
You know what I saw that I think could be really neat, and maybe this is where we could have like a joint collab adventure on
Hmm.
this is I don't know if you follow Lane Norton. He is a human PhD nutritionist who has
Okay.
outworked. He's got a bunch of different ventures, but he's
Hmm.
very, very evidence based, and he's quite spicy. Like he's spicier than I am, certainly more than you are, um,
Yeah.
to the point where he can be a little inflammatory on the other side. But
Hmm.
he has this really awesome, he's very, very evidence based, and he has this really neat service for lay people where it's
Mhm.
a journal club. So you show
Oh.
up and, that you pay for a service, and I don't know how often, maybe week, every other week, every month,
Mhm.
you show up, they post the journal the article ahead of time, and then you show up, and then he or one of the people that works with him breaks the study down. And it's like, this
Oh,
is a recent
wow.
study on, exercise and protein intake. And they break it
Mhm.
down and say, well, here's what's wrong with these stats, or, these controls weren't
Yeah.
ideal, and because there's no perfect study, right? Like, there's no such thing.
No.
Like,
Oh my gosh, no.
nobody can create the perfect study. That's why we have
No.
the greater scientific consensus, is because
Yeah.
it's hard to do. Because it's
Yeah.
research is hard, and it's
Yeah.
hard to overcome all the variables in a living
Yeah.
system.
100%.
Um,
Yeah.
and so there is never going to be a perfect study. And
No.
the researcher themselves will be the first to admit all the
Oh,
limitations
100%. Oh,
of their own
yeah.
of their own studies, like, to the point where it's almost like, okay, it was still a good study. Like, don't rip it
Yeah.
apart too hard. Like, like,
Yeah.
someone asks you about your own research and, like, oh my gosh, and I should have done this, and like,
Yeah.
it was still a really great
Yeah.
study. Don't rip it apart too bad.
Yeah.
But I think that would be a really valuable resource for pet
Yeah.
guardians, is like a
100%.
nutrition journal club where you show up,
Yeah.
and then also where we talk about benchmark studies, like
Oh, yes.
original literature, like some of the
Yes.
OG research of why we set certain nutrients where we do, or what we know about
Mhm.
bioavailability, and so that we don't have to repeat them, right? Because even
Yes.
though, yes, literature should be current, and we should
Mhm.
always be like moving that brick of knowledge down the road,
Mhm.
there's benchmark studies that we don't need to go back and do, right? Because a lot
Oh,
of them were
yeah.
done where the animal was sacrificed, right? Like, so the
Yeah.
animal was euthanized,
Yeah.
or we had to, like, go in and, like, learn about copper or minerals. You got to go and
Yeah.
take the liver out and grind up the liver. And
Yeah.
we
They're
don't want to
tough.
have to be repeating those more than we
Yeah.
have to, because
Yeah.
we don't want to be sacrificing lives if we
Yeah.
don't have to. But that also doesn't mean that study was
Is
bad just because it was
invalid.
done in the
Yeah.
70s, right? It's
Yeah.
invalid because it was done in
Mhm.
1950 or 1960.
Yeah.
Um, and often I feel like even sometimes my veterinary colleagues will kind of be critical of a study for that reason. But that's why I think it's so important that, especially with something like nutrition,
Mhm.
where this idea of a team approach towards
Mhm.
nutrition is so important. So having, veterinarians that are GPs and specialists and nutritionists, and people with master's degree in nutrition, and
Mhm.
PhDs in nutrition, and formulators that have PhDs, and especially like at a pet food company, and
Oh,
then
yeah.
having food safety experts who have advanced training and credentials and degrees in specifically, like, different processing methods, right? You can get a
Yes.
master's degree and do research in canning. You can be an expert in canning. You
Mhm.
can be an expert in fresh. You can be an expert in
Yeah.
food processing. So having the different processing type and having all of those experts work together and
Mhm.
collaborate, I think, prevents us from falling, one, into echo chambers,
Oh, yeah.
and two, realizing the importance of this team approach. I really,
Mhm.
and I'd love to get your thoughts on this. It really, I
Mhm.
love the WASAVA guidelines. I
Mhm.
don't like how it changed recently. First,
Yeah.
it was, do you have a board certified veterinary nutritionist on staff?
Yeah.
And I was like, not every company may not need that and can't afford that, and it doesn't make it a
Yeah.
bad company. And I
Yeah.
have colleagues who have master's degrees and PhDs in food formulation, and are, oh my
Mhm.
gosh, my mentors. Like, they taught me what I know, and they're
Mhm.
not veterinarians and they're not veterinary nutritionists, but doesn't mean that
Yeah.
they're not incredibly knowledgeable in nutrition. And so this idea that with nutrition, like, this team
Mhm.
approach is
Yeah.
really important. So I am glad that Wasabi changes. So now I forget
Yes.
exactly what the wording is, but
I
it's
think it
someone with
said something
advanced
about
credentials.
PhD. Yeah,
Yeah.
PhD and
PhD,
then or
masters.
masters
Yep.
in formulation. Yeah.
Yes. So that
Yeah.
it's a little bit broader now.
Yeah.
Because for a while it was like, oh, do you have a board certified veterinary nutritionist? And actually, in most residencies, we get very little training in specifically formulation, like for the masses and in
Yeah.
canning. And like, sometimes the formulations that we make will gum up a machine. Like, we
Yeah.
physically wouldn't be able to make it. It wouldn't get through
Yeah.
the extruder. It wouldn't get through the freeze drying process, or whatever the type
Mhm.
of food it is, because of X, Y, and Z. And so working with a master's or PhD
Yeah.
formulator, so important. So I'll be like, yeah, no, like,
Yeah.
you're gonna break $100,000 machine
Oh,
here if we
yeah.
try to put these ingredients through. Or So this idea of collaboration, I think, is so important.
Oh, 100%.
And
Yeah.
exposing pet guardians to that, of not
Yes.
just going, oh, like only listening to their veterinarian for nutrition advice. Because
Yeah.
some veterinary programs have very little nutrition knowledge. Like
Yeah.
I would say that your nutrition expertise is greater as somebody who has a master's degree and isn't a
Yeah.
veterinarian than
Yeah.
some of the veterinarians out there. And I think any veterinarian with intellectual humility would admit to that. Like, oh yeah,
Yeah.
no, I know
Yeah.
about nutrition. I can make recommendations. I'm,
Hmm.
qualified to do that. But yeah, Mikaela, she really knows her stuff about nutrition. She's got a
Yeah.
dedicated master's degree
Yeah.
and can talk about, the thermodynamics of macronutrients and bomb
Yeah.
calorimetry to a level that,
Is
most
insane.
vets
Yeah,
can't.
that people
Yeah.
don't want to hear. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, where I'm like, "Ooh, bomb calorimeter. What kind of bomb
Yeah.
calorimeter did you use?" And like, we could really
Yeah.
geek out on this, and our listeners will be like, "Oh
Yeah.
my gosh, like glaze
Yeah.
over on us."
What does
But
this even mean?
right,
Yeah.
right.
I
Um,
really appreciated that with the University of Guelph because their
mm,
vet schools like was essentially next door to the building that I was working in, and there was a professor who works a lot with the vets, and has a
mhm,
PhD, and how essentially like when they have a veterinary nutritionist on like there to complete their residency, they how it's like essentially just a bunch of PhDs that are their mentors a lot of the time, and
mhm,
how they use the PhDs to explain concepts to the vets so that the vets can kind of explain the concepts to the pet parents and stuff,
mhm,
because then it's like the scientific communications like slightly, you know what I mean, it's easier to pass along, I guess, that way, because it's some I find that I think that's kind of like a hard thing with like being in academia is breaking it down
yeah.
for to a level that some people will understand. Like it's something that you have to practice a lot, and then you run the risk of oversimplifying it, where then people are like, oh well, blueberries can cure cancer, and it's like, well, not really. It's just that I've misspoke or something, or I've made it too simple now and they don't actually understand what's going on. And yeah, so that's what I appreciated with Guelph a lot, is how collaborative it really was, like the department that I was in and how closely they worked with like the vet college. It was pretty awesome. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so not only having that intellectual humility, but I think that's, to your point, is important.
Hmm.
If you hear something on social media, um, asking, just saying, "What'd you mean
Hmm.
by that?" Right? Like,
Yeah.
oh, because it's making content is hard, and it's really
Yeah.
hard to cover a complex topic like nutrition in
Hmm.
a 30-second reel. Like it,
Oh
like
yeah.
sometimes I just sit there and stare at my computer, and I'm like, I can't make it that
Oh
simple.
yeah.
Like I get so caught in my head where I'm like, I can't talk about kidney
Yeah.
disease and nutrition for kidney disease, and I can't
No.
even do it in an hour long scene. Like, never mind
Yeah.
a 30-second reel.
Hmm.
But sometimes if you oversimplify, you leave
Hmm.
out so much of the nuance
Oh
that
yeah.
it leaves it too open to interpretation. And I think that's what I love about like having you in the space
Hmm.
of social media is, and I think is so important, is so many interesting discussions can happen in the comments.
Hmm.
And I know that I've gone into other people's content and just linked you and your
Yeah.
work and said, go
Yeah.
see,
Thanks. Yeah.
Michaela has an awesome post on this. Go see it. I'm not going to
Hmm.
recreate it because she did such a beautiful job. I don't have to.
Yeah. Yeah.
And some of the most interesting learning can happen in sometimes the comments. If people are
Hmm.
kind
Oh yeah.
and offer generosity of assumptions and say, well, what would you mean by that?
Yeah.
Or please
Hmm.
elaborate more. Or how about this? Like, there's a difference between, like, there's somebody doing it in one of my recent posts now where they're just like arguing a dogma,
Yeah.
like about
Yeah.
ridiculousness. And they're like,
Hmm.
I'm not being mean. And I'm like, no, you're not being mean or rude, but like, you're also
Yeah.
not contributing to the conversation at all,
No,
really.
it's not
You're just
going
arguing.
anywhere.
Yeah, you're not going. You're
Yeah.
just arguing because you think
Hmm.
that, no cat should ever consume a carb ever in its life. And that,
Yeah.
it's like, oh, so much more nuance than that.
Yeah.
But also saying, oh, what do you mean by that? And then you can be like, oh,
Hmm.
I can see. Yes, I didn't, like, okay, yep, in this context. And you can explain yourself a little bit better in the
Yeah.
comments and
Yeah.
have a little bit more of that discussion.
Oh yeah.
What has been your experience in social media? And you've been doing it much longer than I have.
It's been pretty good. Like only recently, like that last post that I did was the first time that I've kind of like gone in on misinformation. Normally, I kind of was just posting like, oh, like this is how you know if a source is good or not. And that was like the last time that a post really got to me, where I was like, okay, I
Mhm.
need to like say something. So I haven't really drawn too much attention to myself. I think I've just gotten like a lot of vets or pet parents like liking it or sharing it. And then I'm like, that's good. I think because it's mostly just been non-biased or like a positive space. And I'm trying to like, keep it like that because
Yeah.
I'm like, um, kind of of the frame of mind where not every diet's gonna one single diet's gonna suit everybody. So I don't want a pet parent to ever feel judged coming to my page. Like if they want to feed raw, like that's what they want to feed, as long as they're doing it safely or they're getting it from like a reputable brand that is undergoing the taking the proper precautions and stuff. That's fine with me, right? And they understand that there's risks. So that's just the way that I've been kind of running my social media, is where
Mhm.
it's kind of a safe place for people to ask questions and stuff. So yeah, I haven't had too many problems. I think maybe most of the drama is not maybe on Instagram, so that's probably why. And yeah,
Yeah, and you don't go looking for it. I think you're probably
no,
people tend to. I don't go looking for it either, but I get like tagged a lot or
oh
sent
yeah,
to, and then it falls in my lap, and I'm like, how
yeah,
can I ignore this? This
yeah,
is, and usually I pause because not everything that comes your way is it your responsibility to like correct the
hmm,
misinformation or shut it down. But if it's something that
hmm,
I feel like could cause harm, um,
yes,
because it absolutely does. Like there'd
yeah,
be cases in, and I didn't realize where it was coming from in clinics
hmm,
until I got on social media. And there was even one particular content creator in general where I was like,
hmm,
oh my gosh, this is where the
oh
last
yeah,
the issues that I've had in the last 10 patients
are
that have
coming
been on
from,
this.
yeah,
It's here. This is
yeah,
it. And I don't think they don't realize it. Of course they don't realize it because
no,
generosity of assumptions. They love animals, right? They're like,
hmm,
they want to
yeah.
help. They're not trying to cause
Yeah.
harm, but they don't realize the damage that they're doing
No. No. Not at
and the
all. No.
harm that they're causing. And that, when veterinarians say we're concerned about raw food feeding, like there's a
Hmm.
reason behind it.
Yes. Yeah.
There's a risk, but then at the same time,
Hmm.
that pendulum can, to your point, like flip in the total opposite
Hmm.
direction, where it's like, veterinarians won't even entertain or have a conversation about raw at all. And they'll be like, don't do
Yeah.
it. Don't do it. Just
No.
don't do it.
No.
And
Yeah.
human nature is human nature. Like, what are you going to
Yeah.
do when someone tells you not to do something? Like,
You're
come
gonna
on,
want to
let's all
do it.
admit you're going to want to do it, right? Like,
Yeah.
at least have the conversation about the risk because there's risk
Yeah.
in everything that we do. There's risk in walking across the street. There's
Oh
risk
yeah.
in any supplement or medication that we give. And informed consent
Hmm.
that's the backbone of
Yes.
practicing good medicine. So just informing clients of the risks and let them decide. And
Yeah.
I had a immunology professor, Ron Schultz, at the University of Wisconsin, and he's known for the 5-year rabies vaccine. Like we have a 5-year rabies vaccine because of Ronald Schultz.
Hmm.
And he would speak about he's an immunology professor, so
Hmm.
vaccines, and he would give lectures to he's world renowned
Yeah.
for his immunology
Mm.
contributions, and so
Yeah.
he'd speak for pet groups and breed clubs, and everyone would ask him like, Dr. Schultz, what do you vaccinate your own animals for? And
Hmm.
he would say, I need to qualify that. I need to
Hmm.
qualify that with my own personal level of risk that I
Yeah.
am comfortable assuming. He goes, I drive
Yeah.
motorcycles and I fly airplanes. So
Yeah.
my comfort with risk is much greater probably than your average person. So
Yeah.
we need to qualify it with that
Yeah.
and that's kind of where I and just listening to him talk about vaccines and risk and go, oh
Hmm.
yeah, pet food's the same, right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, there's risks, just as much risk with a poorly formulated kibble that doesn't have the appropriate quality control or safety than
Yeah.
a really well formulated route that does have like a multi-hurdle safety
Yeah.
protocol
Yeah.
that is testing to make sure the product's safe at the time of
For
manufacturing as it
sure.
is the time it reaches the pet's bowl. And so
Yeah.
just having that conversation with the pet guardian and then letting them make
Yeah.
their own choice
Yeah.
and saying, okay, maybe, yeah, I do have kids that are in the pet's bowl licking the bowl a lot. And I have an
Yeah.
immunocompromised dog on chemotherapy. And I also have my elderly parent living with me. And so yeah,
Yeah.
maybe now's not the right time for that. And, can we cook it or do
Yeah.
something else? And, or even just the question of what's the best food to feed my pet, right? Like, we don't know.
Yeah, no, that's what I say. There isn't
We
one.
don't know.
There really
There
isn't.
isn't
Like,
one.
I
We
can't
don't
just
know.
give you one just like that. You're gonna have to tell me what you're doing every day and what your dog's like, what breed your dog is, like everything, like before I can just kind of, because when people, so because I have a dog, so I'll walk him and then I'll casually mention sometimes that like I am like a pet, like I run a pet nutrition business, and they'll be like, well, what should I feed my dog? And I'm like, well, I can't just like
Yeah.
give you that right off the top of my head. There's a lot of
Right.
questions I need to ask. There's a lot of people I'm going to need to contact. And so I don't, yeah, it's not as easy as people realize. So,
And I think that's so important to highlight is when people are getting their information or getting recommendations on what to feed, certainly veterinary nutritionists don't need to gatekeep all consults
no.
on veterinary nutrition. You have consultations with pet guardians and
Hmm.
absolutely can make really wonderful
Hmm.
guidelines and help because people unfortunately aren't often getting that from their veterinarian. There's
Yeah.
a lot of studies showing that up to 70% of patients are walking out of their vet's exam room feeling like they didn't get a specific recommendation, or especially if
Yeah.
they want to do something a little bit non-conventional or have
Hmm.
a conversation about it. Maybe not even end
Yeah.
up doing that, but they just want to have the conversation. Like they just want to talk it through with you and somebody who is non-biased,
Hmm.
non-branded,
Yeah.
neutral. You don't work for a pet food company.
No.
Um,
Yeah.
and they just want to talk through the pros and the cons and
Hmm.
learn about what do we need to look for in pet food companies to make sure that they're safe? Like if they want to
Yeah.
do raw, what should they be doing? Like sure,
Hmm.
HPP, but is it validated, right? Like, are they
Hmm.
testing to make sure that is it multi-hurdle um, and all that? And so what is the one of the biggest things I can think of is it's not even necessarily letters after your name, right? Like there's not like a
No.
certain
Yeah.
3 letters pet guardians need to look for. It doesn't
No.
always have to be a veterinary nutritionist.
Yeah.
I often want to make sure that somebody says, oh yeah, it depends, right?
Hmm.
Like if someone can say it depends and
Yeah.
then have a conversation about, okay, what is your lifestyle like? What is your budget like? What
Yes.
is your pet like?
Yeah.
And then have, credentials matter, right? Like having an
Hmm.
advanced degree, it does
Hmm.
it does matter because
Yeah.
having those critical thinking skills that can break down and look at the studies and say, yeah, that's valid, that's not, or that company's doing what it should be for
Hmm.
making sure the product is safe and complete and balanced and efficacious, or no, they're really not, and here's why. That does require a certain skill set that
Yeah.
you are taught when you get a master's degree
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
nutrition.
Yeah.
So while credentials are important, it's almost more important that someone isn't vilifying
No.
any
Yeah.
particular ingredient or food,
Hmm.
or and that's often
Oh,
a really easy red flag that
yes.
people can look for
Yeah.
on social
Yeah.
media or um, any media, right? Like not just
Yeah.
social media, advertisements or
Hmm.
at a
Oh, yeah.
speaking event or at
Yeah.
a conference or whatnot. Are they vilifying? Is they only talking about one versus the other? Only one
Yeah.
company, and that all that
Yeah.
can influence. What do you think is something that is really commonly misunderstood about nutrition? Or like what is a common thing that your people that you consult with are asking you about?
Oh, it would definitely be like no carbohydrates, just from like just from what they've seen like online. I get a lot of people worried when I'm like recommending kibble and stuff that there's like carbohydrates in it, or they'll be like, "Oh, this is a filler," and I'm like, "Well, not really." And I'll break it down where because I'll use like the nutrient database online and I'll actually show them like, no, this isn't really a filler. Like there's actually like quite a lot of nutrients in this. And
Yeah.
so that I think that actually them seeing it is helpful because a lot of the time people make these claims where they'll be like, oh, corn's a filler or rice or something. And then once you actually like show them like, well, here's like 100 grams of rice versus 100 grams of chicken. And then they're able to actually see like, oh, there actually is quite a lot of stuff in rice still. And it's like, yeah, like, and people don't realize that, you know, that there's actually data out there for this or that they can access it. So I think they get more comfortable when they can actually like visualize it and stuff. So that's definitely the most common thing I see is people worried about carbohydrates constantly.
Yeah.
Or another one, I did make a post about this once where people were saying, well, I'm worried about my dog being dehydrated on kibble
Hmm.
instead of feeding like raw or fresh or like canned food. I'm like, well, that's probably not going to happen unless there's something wrong. So I have to like break it down like your dogs are more complicated than that. Like living animals are more complicated than that. Like their body's able to regulate so that they know that they need to drink more. So,
Mhm.
and yeah, it's just I find what I find most frustrating is when I go to a client and they're scared about that they're going to do the wrong thing, and I find that really frustrating, like for them. Like I feel so bad for like them, that because they don't understand, because they've been scared now, and they because there's so much information out there and they don't really know what to believe. And so I have to like break it down and really just kind of take the time and be like, well, there's a lot of opinions out there, but in it's not so scary. You're not going to make a terribly, a couple days of you feeding the wrong food isn't going to be terrible, is like what I have to explain to them. Like, let's just try this. It should be okay for a bit. And then they start to feel more comfortable. Like, once I actually explain like the data, or they're afraid of certain brands, and I have to be like, well, no, this is actually a good brand because of what they've contributed to research, and, the kind of people that they employ. And then they kind of understand that they've almost been duped a bit by
Mhm.
by what reading
Marketing.
online and stuff. Yeah,
Mhm.
it's just the
Yeah.
worst.
Marketing hype. Yep. Yep. I
Yeah.
was just saying that often what I'll guide clients to do if they, because they're like, how do I know what to believe? How do I know what not? It's so scary out there. And I'll
Mhm.
say, if you see even an ad on the TV, and if it's
Mhm.
invoking a strong emotion
Oh
within you,
yeah.
pause, take a breath, take a
Mhm.
beat, right? Pause and think,
Yeah.
okay, is that the goal of that ad or
Yeah.
that social media post? Or, is that marketing team intentionally invoking fear is a very
Yeah.
powerful motivator. And
Mhm.
guilt is a very powerful motivator. So if
Mhm.
they're, and especially if they show it to a trusted family member or colleague or anybody and say like, what are your
Yeah.
thoughts on this? How are you feeling after you watch this or see this? I'm like, oh, I feel terrified, or that makes me mad. It's like,
Yeah.
that's probably marketing, right? Like that's marketing
Yeah.
at its finest.
Yeah.
Probably don't, if it's factual based, science doesn't usually
Mhm.
sell, right? Like
No.
it's not really sexy. It
No.
doesn't, it's very neutral by design. It's not really meant
Yeah.
to invoke emotion. It's not meant to make you be
No.
afraid. It's not meant to make you
Yeah.
be scared. It's not, not
Yeah.
meant to invoke guilt. And so,
Yeah.
um, if an ad or a company or someone is invoking an emotion that strongly,
Mhm.
walk away.
Yeah.
don't fall for it. Walk away.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. I constantly say that, where I'm like, if you're thinking, like, if you're seeing a brand that's constantly dragging on like another brand, I'm like,
yeah,
it's probably not the one for you. Like, it's they probably don't have, a solid foundation in their food, and they're having to use these marketing tactics to drag down something that is actually a good food. And I have to, that's not the one to go with, they're
exactly. But
just
also
playing
on
with
the
your
other side of
emotions.
that coin is cognitive dissonance, which if
Oh,
listeners don't know what
yes.
that is, it's where
Yeah.
something that you have previously believed to be true is
Mm-hmm.
challenged. And you have to maybe think about that and come on the other side and adopt a different
Mm-hmm.
viewpoint or
Yeah.
readjust your understanding of a particular carbs, right? Like carbs are not the devil. They're not
No,
causing cancer. They're not causing diabetes.
no,
Kibble is not going to give your dog or cat cancer or,
no.
cause diabetes or, kidney failure. It's not that
Mm-hmm.
simple. If anyone's claiming that, they lack the nuance and understanding
Yes.
of nutrition. But
Yeah.
often even just like you could make a very neutral post,
Mm-hmm.
but that causes someone to be angry. And that doesn't mean that
Yeah.
you're using like marketing tactics and logical
Yeah.
fallacies to prey on someone's emotions. They're experiencing cognitive dissonance. So that's why I tell
Yeah.
people take a beat and show it to someone
Mm-hmm.
else. Because if it
Yeah.
doesn't evoke the same response in them,
Yeah.
um, then it might be their own cognitive dissonance that they
Mm-hmm.
may need to like go look at those resources that you posted in the end
Yeah.
of your post and go look at that and ask some
Yeah.
other experts and
Yeah.
broaden their echo chamber, right? Because often if you fall into, that's what people do, is they fall into an echo chamber because it's
Yes.
comfortable
Yeah.
and it's perpetuating the ideas that they believe to be true, where
Mm-hmm.
it's really important to get information from a variety of different sources with a variety of different, we all have biases, right? Like we all have our own
Yes.
opinions, we all have our own biases, we all have our own
Yeah.
leanings, we all have our own blind spots. But
Mm-hmm.
in putting ourselves in diverse settings of information collection,
Mm-hmm.
we're going to be more likely to acknowledge and see those blind spots. Oh gosh, thanks
Yes.
so much. You're right. I didn't even
Yeah.
realize that.
Yeah.
I only follow these three pet foods, or, like I'm only comfortable with these three pet foods and that's the only ones I'm
Yeah.
going to recommend. And it's just because that's what I have the most exposure to, right? Like
Yeah,
there's
for
there is
sure.
that too,
Yeah.
like of
Yeah.
comfort. It's easy. The brain looks for, and that's a heuristic, right? Like the brain looks
Hmm.
for easy, quick connections so that we don't
Yeah.
have to do mental gymnastics. So life is hard and exhausting. So as the
Yeah.
human brain looks for those short, quick connections.
Yeah.
So that is normal. It doesn't make someone a bad person or even not a smart person, or
Yeah.
that's just human nature. So
Hmm.
broadening horizons is
Yes.
so important for
Yeah.
that reason. And
Hmm.
I would love to just give you, can we do like a slow clap without
Yeah.
like blowing out everyone's audios?
Yeah.
There was so many of your posts are so good. But
Yeah.
recently I was just like, oh, mic drop, Mikaela, mic drop,
Hmm.
where
Thank you.
carbs.
Yeah.
There was the
Yeah.
carb one, and it was what we were talking a little bit about before was a
Yeah.
benchmark study. It was a benchmark study
Yes.
on carbohydrates, and
Hmm.
carbohydrates are not a requirement for dogs and cats. And so
Yeah.
you'll hear people say, because it's not required, they don't need it.
Yeah.
And why then it shouldn't be in there. It's like, well, they don't
Well,
need it. The
yeah.
body can get energy from two other sources,
Elsewhere.
right? There's three
Yeah.
macronutrients where the
Hmm.
body can convert
Yeah.
into energy. So they don't need the carbohydrate. They can get it from protein and fat, but it's very energetically expensive to get it from protein.
Yes. Yes.
And fat, can lead to obesity and other challenges. And
Yeah.
so it's not a bad thing to
Hmm.
have some carbohydrates in the diet. And this particular study was a benchmark study looking at
Hmm.
it's conditionally essential. So it's a really good idea
Yes.
to have carbohydrates in the diet of pregnant and lactating both dogs and cats. And there's been
Yeah.
a number of studies showing that it can be
Yeah.
very beneficial in there. And I don't think it has to be if the diet's well formulated, but
Yeah.
I think it's a good idea. I think
Yeah.
it's a good idea.
Yeah.
And there was a social media influencer, and this is where I get very concerned, is that there's a group of I'm not going to say it. It's a tagline. It's actually been patent protected, and it's
Oh.
certified canine blank, and it's been
Okay.
patent
Yes.
protected. You'll see it
Yes.
hashtag blank blank blank. That's
Yeah.
patent protected by a
Yeah.
paralegal who created a course.
Okay.
It is now
Yes.
certifying anybody off the street can take
Yeah.
this course. A veterinary nutritionist wasn't anywhere near it. There was one PhD who did their PhD in ruminant nutrition that was
Ugh.
associated with it, but nobody else.
The ruminant
So
is such
talking
a
about
big
negative,
stretch.
right?
Like
And
to
yeah,
yeah.
and this individual is now a big proponent of raw food feeding, and will tell you
Yes.
that carbs are the root of all evil, and kibble's killing your dogs and cats, and that's
Yes.
basically what this course says. And then now it
Yeah.
certifies dog trainers and groomers, and it trains them in on a balancing software that's
Okay.
actually very inaccurate. I
Oh
tried it. I
no.
used it. I found that it's about 25 to 30% inaccurate.
Ooh.
Um, yeah, which is terrifying. And now they're
That's
training lay
dangerous.
people with no
Yeah.
nutrition background. There's no prereqs. Like you don't have to take a
No.
nutritional biochemistry course. You don't have to have a
Yeah.
undergraduate degree in biology, like
Yeah.
chemistry. Anybody off the street can take
Yeah.
this, become a certified blank blank, get access to this formulator, have
Hmm.
consults with pet guardians, and make them homemade diets.
Oh.
Um, and that individual, that the post that you addressed, and you did it
Hmm.
so professionally, and
Yeah.
you are less of a spicy tamale than I am, and I
Yeah.
give you tremendous kudos
Well,
for that.
yeah.
Um, they posted something really ridiculous, and they put up a
Yeah.
study
It
and
was
like, this is blah
crazy.
blah blah, and this is ridiculous, and it's so
Yeah.
old, and well, I can't believe we
Yeah.
would even be still looking at this. And your post just went and said, okay, let's actually go look at this study. And you
Yeah.
just broke down the whole thing from the um, the whole scientific process. You broke it all down. You
Yeah.
put the
Yeah.
statistics, you broke down the controls, you broke
Yeah.
down the findings, and in a way
Yeah.
that was like a condensed journal club in a post. And I was like,
That's the way I was treating
this
it.
is
Yeah.
beautiful. And
Yeah.
how long did it take you to make that post? How
Oh my
long did
God. Well, it took a while because for this at the start I was literally just staring at my computer. I was like, I don't know if I should do this. I was like so mad at this post because I found that he was like they were vilifying researchers
yeah.
and like these terrible claims. And I was like, that's not what happened at all. And so I like went to this study and I opened it up on my iPad and I treated it like a journal club because I'd seen the study
Mhm.
before, obviously, and
Yeah.
I just started making like new notes on it and like looked at the statistical analysis and their charts and stuff. And I was like, okay, I should probably do this. So I think it took me probably about 5 or 6 hours because I kept
Yeah.
like making sure, like double checking, like if this is the right thing to do. So I literally treated it like I was going to give a presentation at school
Yep.
and then posted it. And I was so relieved after I posted it. I was like, you know what? I think I felt better because
Yeah.
I just didn't like the claims that this person was
Mhm.
making. And yeah, it was just, oh my goodness, it was very frustrating. And yeah, I broke it down and compared it to the post as well, where I
Yep.
kind of like called out certain claims. And
Mhm.
yeah, yeah, I think it's I understand that like science is supposed to be open-minded and stuff, but that was just crazy. Like some of the claims just didn't really make sense and
Yeah.
just drawing conclusions way too readily without actually understanding like the basic science behind
Yes.
it. And people don't realize like how many courses, like basic foundation courses you have to take before
Yeah.
you can actually like understand nutrition or
Mhm.
like just anything. Like I had to take lots of physiology. I had to take like tons of cell bio courses and biochem and organic chemistry before you even can think about taking these, nutritional courses. Like,
Yeah.
so you have to have like a really strong background in how to do like just basic science or how the basic, mammalian body works. And whoever this was just kind of skipped that and didn't really understand just like, the biochemistry of body or physiology. And so I think that's where some of the mistakes were made. And I try and give people the benefit of the doubt where I'm like, I can understand why the study is frustrating because the puppies do pass away, right? And
Yeah. Yep.
and it's very emotional and it is an
Mhm.
old study, but it's kind of a necessity, in science where you do
Yep.
have these kind of studies and stuff, and it causes like progress to be made. And like I think I talked about the benefit of like animal ethics, how they kind of have to do this
Yeah.
analysis as
Mhm.
well. It like most of the
Yeah, what
time.
IACUC is and how
Yeah.
hard it is actually to get,
Yes.
even just test on animals, even if,
Oh my gosh.
there's no
Yeah.
harm to come of them, it's still
No.
tremendous hurdles to jump through
Very
to get
difficult.
to
Yes.
use animals in a research
Yeah.
protocol. So yeah, they are protected, and they have
Hmm.
an advocate, right? Like they have an advocate
Yeah.
in the IACUC committee to even be
Yes.
able to utilize them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this
Yeah. And
notion
then,
that
oh, sorry. Yeah. I was gonna say,
carbohydrates are, yeah.
oh, yeah. I was gonna say I wasn't even sure, like when I originally looked at the study, because I looked at the researchers, like all their other studies. Like one of these researchers was so prolific, had like over 300 publications, and used a lot of like animal models, so like mice and
Mhm.
rats, and then I think there was like a monkey or two as well, or chicken. So I wasn't even sure at the start if the study, because first like I obviously looked at the authors first, and I wasn't even sure before I made the post if the study was even intended to be used for canine research or canine use, or if it was
Mm,
beagles being
mhm.
used for like an animal model for humans. And so that was like something that I was also thinking about talking about in the post, was like, sometimes these studies can be used in different areas of research where,
Mhm.
it might have been done to prove why, pregnant humans need to eat carbohydrates, but now the pet nutrition industry kind of boomed around that time. So, they kind of also saw the benefit of the study. And I just, actually like looking at it, you can see they do reference the NRC and stuff. So I was like, okay, I think maybe it was for canine nutrition, but yeah, it was people, yeah, like you said, there's a lot of nuance in science
Yeah,
in
like,
looking
is
at
it in the
studies.
species it's intended in, right? Like, you gotta
Yes.
start somewhere. You gotta start in the petri dish with the cells, and
Oh
then you gotta
yeah.
move to usually mice, and then eventually your species of intent, and it's not that
Mhm.
that's not valuable information. We just have to be careful about the assumptions that we draw based upon
Mhm.
that study or that information. So that's a great point of,
Mhm.
even though it's in dogs,
Yeah.
were they modeling it for human gestation of,
Yes.
and carbohydrate, intake? And
Yeah.
so can we even though it's in dogs, can we necessarily extrapolate it to say like, okay, we do have to have carbohydrates for,
Yeah.
lower mortality rates of puppies and better,
Yeah.
lactating, females and all
Yeah.
that. And to your point, how do you do that? You look and say, okay, yep, NRC was utilized, and
Yeah.
What was the outcome? What was the takeaways? What model did they use? Like what, and this is also where that knowledge and knowing of what physiologic process they're talking about. Like if they're
Mm-hmm.
referencing back to pregnant women a lot and,
Yeah.
the bioavailability or breakdown or, within humans and then
Yeah.
modeling that a lot with the dog in the study, then they're probably
Mm-hmm.
then trying to find that parallel rather than just purely looking at it for dogs in
Yeah.
dogs.
Yeah.
Um, and having that again, knowing Krebs cycle and a Krebs cycle in a dog is the same
Oh
as
yeah.
Krebs cycle in a human, but
Yeah.
all the things that go on before and after that are very different physiologically,
Mm-hmm.
anatomically than with the species differences in there.
Yeah.
And that was such a wonderful,
Yeah.
wonderful
Thanks.
takeaway. And that,
Yeah.
yeah, carbs, they don't need to be vilified.
No.
Do they reduce the cost of a diet? Yeah, they do.
Yeah.
Do some companies maybe use more carbohydrates than might be optimal for certain individuals
Yeah.
to
Maybe.
reduce the cost? Maybe, but at
Yeah.
the same time, if maybe the person wouldn't be able to feed the diet to their animal if it
Yeah.
wasn't at a reduced cost. But so is it a bad
Yeah.
thing in there? No.
No. Yeah.
Um, no, and we don't know what the optimal nutrient ratio is in terms of
No.
macros, like macronutrient ratio for
Yeah.
dogs and cats. Like, will cats live longer if they eat like a mouse in a can?
Yeah.
Uh, we
Don't
don't
know
know. We
yet.
don't know, right? We don't
Yeah.
know yet.
Yeah.
Hopefully, maybe someday we will have that data,
Yeah.
or maybe we won't. But we'll have
Mm-hmm.
the information of is letting people make that decision. Like, okay, maybe
Mm-hmm.
let's say we do get the mouse and the model data someday.
Mm-hmm.
And it is okay, yep, cats maybe have a 20% less chance of developing urinary
Mm-hmm.
issues, whether that's crystals or stone formation or, or even maybe lead less of a chance leading to kidney disease. We don't know that. I'm not saying that
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
Not even saying
Hypothetical. Yeah.
hypothetical. If we find
Yeah.
out, but
Yeah.
maybe it's 20%, right? Like maybe it's 5%, maybe it's
Mm-hmm.
2%. So maybe it's
Yeah.
there, but barely. And it's so much more expensive to feed
Mm-hmm.
that like fresh mouse in a can model
Yeah.
that maybe we find that excludes a lot of cat owners, that a lot of people wouldn't be able to afford that and also provide basic veterinary care for their cat and do other things that they need to do for enrichment and
Mm-hmm.
that are really important for their cats mental health and quality
Yes.
of life. And so then is it worth it, right? So then you have to do
Yeah.
like, okay, maybe
Yeah.
sure it's a little bit better to do the mouse in a can, but
Yeah.
people can't afford it. And then they can decide if it's in your
Mm-hmm.
budget, if it's not a bad thing. So
Yeah.
it's kind of like, I liken it almost, it's probably a bad analogy and I'm probably going to regret it as soon as I say it, but I'm going to say it anyway, is then it's like chemotherapy, right? You can
Oh yeah.
talk about like you have cancer.
Mm-hmm.
One of your options of treatment is chemo. This is what you'll get. This is probably how much longer it'll extend their life. These are the side effects. This is how much it'll
Mm-hmm.
cost. And you can make that decision. So people can make that ahead of time, knowing what we know about the data that we have on hand and how much it's going to cost. And okay, you maybe have a 2% increased likelihood of X, Y, or Z if it even does show that
Mm-hmm.
there's a benefit, and they can make that decision themselves. But I don't know that and I'd love to hear your take on that. Like, do you think it's going to be dramatic? Do you think there's going to be a dramatic, like, mic drop moment of, hey, everything that these people have said about kibble or carbs is actually true, and we've been doing it totally
um,
wrong?
I honestly don't, if there is one, it's not going to be for a while, I think. Like, because that kind of science would take so long, I think, to actually like make sure to look at the whole lifespan as well, I think would take a while. I know somebody at Guelph is looking at carbohydrates in cats right now and
Mhm.
like the benefits of it. I'm not 100% sure about like the whole like research, obviously, but
Yeah.
yeah. So but I don't think it's like not looking to see if if there's like negatives. It's mostly the benefits of it and what pet parents think and stuff. So, but I honestly could not foresee it happening for like 20 years or something. Like I would be shocked if it would be within like the next 5 years or
Yeah.
something. And I
Yeah.
do tell people that, like, somewhere down the line, like 20 years from now, what we know could be completely changed. Like,
Yeah.
obviously, I don't think like the nutritional like guidelines, like the recommendations or requirements, aren't going to change drastically, like how many amino acids and stuff you need, but like what actually is like the most appropriate diet, like. the macronutrient composition, we might have better insight into that. But people don't realize how much money it costs to do this kind of research, and time. It takes a long time, and some people, you know, some companies aren't contributing, I guess, right? So then we'll never really know. So that's the thing. And who knows? Like, if, and I tell people, if that's the way it goes, then that's fine. Like, most scientists, or, veterinary nutritionists, I guess, or like PhDs, would just be like, yep, that's changed. Like, obviously there would be some resistance at first, but once you actually, like, if it's solid data, I could see people just being like, okay, like, we were wrong. That's the way I think most scientists kind of behave.
Well,
If,
that's right. The very definition of science, right? Is
yeah,
where it's not what we believe or emotion, or it's just what the data
yeah,
says at the moment. And it
yeah,
should change when the data changes.
yeah, yeah.
But yeah, to your point, the cognitive dissonance it creates and the pushback, and
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
could the what we say is the best thing be different next week or tomorrow? Or
Sure,
yeah, I don't
yeah.
know that we would ever get to a point where we're like, oh, we were so wrong that we would
No.
never recommend feeding the way we did 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Probably not, because I feel like at this point we have enough data to say we're doing a pretty good job. Is it the
Yeah.
best? We don't
Mm,
know.
yeah.
But, somebody can't afford fresh, or somebody can't afford,
Hmm.
would it be a bad thing to let them have, kibble? I think that the answer would be no. That, the animal could still be perfectly fine and happy and overall relatively healthy
Yeah.
based on the information we have even today. Could it get better?
Hmm.
Could we do better? Yeah, hopefully. I mean, hope
Yeah.
so. I hope that's like the
Yeah.
point of medicine and science is we want to do
Yeah.
better. We want to help our pets and people, be with us longer and have better qualities of
Hmm.
life longer. But I don't know that we're ever going to be like, no, I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're right. And that everything we were doing and, is horrible. And we were causing all these horrible things to
Yeah.
happen. Like cancer's still going to happen, like
Yeah. Yes, yeah.
it's just
Yep.
this part of the living being. Yeah. Yeah. We're not going to eradicate chronic diseases and
No.
that's the crazy claims that people try to make is you're like, no, this is
No,
not
it's more complicated than that. And there's a book that I want to read that I think it's more complicated than that. I think that's literally the name of the book. And it's written by a psychiatrist who talks about bad science, like in the media and how it interprets science. And I just think like that's like my motto now is like, oh, it's a bit more complicated than that. Like,
Jonathan Stee's book. Yeah, I
so
think
yeah,
Mike. Yeah, he has a great account too on social media
yeah.
about scientific literacy, and
Hmm.
so that would be a great book. We'll maybe put it in the show notes if you can find it, and we can put it in the show
Yeah.
notes for people to find it later.
Yeah.
Well, we have been chatting for quite a long time. You're
Yeah.
fascinating to speak with. I knew you
Yeah.
would be based on your content and your background. That we've provided some really, I think, great information
Hopefully.
and some perspective that people don't usually get, like just walking into their veterinary office, and because you are
Hmm.
truly an expert in nutrition.
It's nice to like talk to a veterinary nutritionist for sure to get that extra like 'cause I tell people I'm like they're like the real experts because I think I've had to refer one person to somebody and say like you should get your vet to refer you to a veterinary nutritionist. Like I can't do this, it's outside of my scope. And I'm like they're the big guns. That's what I always say. Yeah.
And it's funny, and I can provide kind of like the other side of the coin to that, where sometimes I'm
Hmm.
like, yeah, it's great that they want to come and have a conversation with me, but I feel like not everyone is open-minded, and there are
Hmm.
there's a reason why there's a war of the foods, right? There's a reason
Yeah.
why there is this war of the foods is, for the most part, like you said, veterinarians and scientists are just very fact-based, and they will change
Hmm.
their opinion based on the facts and what that does. But if we ignore the
Hmm.
fact that we don't have a lot of data on the other side for a reason, because it's hard to monetize that, right? Like it's hard to monetize a carrot, like
Yeah.
it's not an excuse not to. And I really hope that more companies do more to, advance knowledge and what are they
Hmm.
doing to put the brick of knowledge down the road. And even small companies can have a meaningful impact and
Yeah.
contribution toward that. But there's a war of the foods for a reason. And I
Hmm.
feel like sometimes even my own colleagues are not open-minded enough. And
Yeah.
if we just say to clients, don't don't feed raw,
Hmm.
don't feed fresh, don't.
Yeah.
If they really feel strongly about not feeding their cats carbs, great. There's options, fine. Like we can find
Hmm.
options for them. It doesn't mean
Yeah,
that's all cats shouldn't be having carbs or all
for
dogs
sure.
shouldn't be having carbs so they
Yeah.
don't have the requirement for it. But and so I feel like having that conversation with you because you're just very scientific and balanced, and
Hmm.
so you're gonna have that conversation with them without just being like, don't do it,
Yeah.
don't do
Yeah.
fresh.
Yeah. Like I explained to people that part of evidence base is taking in like personal preference.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like literally part of it is taking personal preference and their environment that they're living in and like cost and just everything. So that's why I say I'm evidence based and like non-biased is because I'm happy to recommend anything really within reason, obviously. But
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
with that particular lifestyle, and yeah, and then pulling
Yeah.
in vet nutritionists when there's multiple nutrient responsive diseases going on, and we need to
Mhm.
pull in the medicine aspect
Mhm.
of than having them. But having a consult with you about their options is so
Mhm.
awesome, or how to interpret information, or what
Yes.
companies are doing, and
Yeah.
um, is amazing. And clients aren't getting that, and so they're going to social media. They're getting it
Yeah.
from the wrong places, and so let's
Yeah.
point them towards people like yourself where they can get that great
Yeah.
information and have
Yeah.
consults with you, and you have the intellectual humility to say
Mhm.
that's a great question. Oh,
Yeah.
go talk to Danielle about that. When you got
Yeah.
that, you can have no nutrients. Like your pet has so
Yeah.
many nutrient responsive
Y-
diseases. They really
Yeah.
only should be having air. You need
Yeah.
to pull in. Now it's time to pull into the nutritionist.
Yeah.
So always being willing to work together and saying,
Mhm.
okay, now's the time. Now's the time. Or even I say this to people again, go, you need to talk about that with your veterinarian. Like
Yeah.
I don't have my hands on the animal
Yeah.
now anymore. I do a lot of teleconsulting.
Mhm.
So sometimes I'm like, you got to go back to your vet, and sometimes it's not the food. Like your pet's having diarrhea, it might not be the food. What do they get into? What's happening? Would they go to a
Yeah.
play date? Or the dog park? And so it is interesting how sometimes you're like, no, it's not the food. It's actually
Yeah.
not the food. Everyone's quick and wants to blame the food, but it's not.
Yeah.
Nutrition's powerful, but it's not always the
No.
correlation
Yeah.
doesn't mean causation. It's not always
Yeah, about
the
that, like nutrition's powerful. I don't know if you've seen this where some people will say, like, it's relatively new, is like nutrigenomics or nutrigenetics. And it's cool. Like the research looks really promising and cool, but people are putting a lot of emphasis on it, I think more than we know right now. Like I did a paper on it during my master's, like because we did a showcase with like another master's student and we were talking about it and I was like, wow, like this is like there's a lot of potential here, like how you could do like precision nutrition essentially if there's genetic mutations. But the way I see some people treating it is going, oh well, if you're
we're
feeding
already there.
while it's
Yeah.
in utero or something, it could completely change the whole life of your dog. And it's like, well, not really, but like it could have an effect. But yeah, I don't know, like what you think about that, like nutrigenomics and stuff.
Yeah.
It's
I think it's the
interesting, but
future, right? Like it's like
yeah.
the sci-fi future of just wellness and medicine. And you're gonna,
Mm-hmm.
even us as humans will walk into our doctor's office, we'll
Mm-hmm.
get a little prick and we'll send it through a machine and it will get
Yeah.
the detailed analysis of here's what you should and shouldn't be eating. Here's your supplement
Mm-hmm.
protocol. Here's the vaccines and vaccine schedule you should be on, or here's what drugs to avoid because you can't metabolize them well. So when you're under anesthesia, get these.
Yeah.
And that'll be the future.
Mm-hmm.
Are we there yet? No. And you're right. I do
No.
see people overdoing it, or even there's companies will find unique ways to take your money, and that like you can send blood analysis
Oh
on
yeah.
your dog or cat to get
Yeah.
what vitamins and minerals they should be on. It's like
Yeah.
hair analysis, and you're like, nope, nope,
No.
nope, we're not there
No.
yet. Would we be
No.
someday? Is it cool?
Yeah.
Is there information we can get from mineral analyses on hair samples? Yeah, sort of,
Yeah.
but just not
Within
tell
reason.
us,
Yeah.
yeah, what you should be doing, and are there
Yeah.
deficiencies present?
Yeah.
You can't put that in a vacuum. And
No.
so yeah, I think it's the future. I think it's super exciting. I think it's really
Mm-hmm.
cool. But you're right. It's being people are saying like, oh yeah,
Yeah.
feed it to your pregnant mom, and this is how it's gonna like
Yes.
cause cancer for generations if you feed one carbohydrate to a
I
puppy or
know.
kitten in utero. And it's like, no, it's not that
Yeah.
simple. Not that
It's
simple.
like people like put like genetics is obviously, like you said, the future, but people forget the like how long dogs and humans and animals have been alive. Like
Yeah.
if that's how fragile like DNA or like DNA replication was, like we wouldn't have lasted this long, right? And my one friend is doing her PhD in genetics, and she said, I think, because I was asking her, because I talk, like I vent about like why people think like that 1% difference of DNA in wolves and dogs, why people put so much effort on that. And she was like, I think it comes down to a lack of like just understanding of what genes are and like genetics and how much that 1% really is. And
Yeah.
like, yeah. And because I was like, I don't know where where the confusion is. And then so that's what she was kind of saying. Like, it's just a lack of understanding. And I'm not sure how to remedy that, but yeah.
By doing what you're doing and just getting accurate
Yeah.
information out there. But to your point, yeah, that every living being shares a huge percentage of the genome.
Hmm.
Even us and
Yeah.
fruit flies have over 70% of the same genome,
Yeah.
which doesn't mean that we should be eating rotten bananas, right? Or,
Yeah.
chimpanzees and humans, it's like 90%. And wolves, it's anywhere from 1% to 3%. But then also they
Yeah.
forget that that wasn't a natural evolution either. People started breeding
No.
dogs. Like we got in there and
No.
took that 7,000-ish years of that natural
Yeah.
kind of evolution and like turned the volume up and amplified that
Yes.
so much. So even that, there's a whole lot of variability within that 1% to 3% of that genomic variation. But that again is a heuristic,
Hmm.
right? It makes it simple for people like, oh,
Yeah.
dogs and wolves, they're 97 to 99% same genome. And so we should,
Hmm.
why are we feeding them differently? And you're like, oh yeah, why is that? And then, oh
Yeah.
wait, heuristic. That's my brain trying to make it simpler than it actually
Yeah.
really is. And so if we can just get people to pause and go, is that true? And have that like healthy level of skepticism, open-minded skepticism, I think is hopefully where people would go to get the best
Hopefully. Yeah.
information, right? Skeptic, be a skeptic, ask, does that make sense? Why? Or, get a consensus of experts and ask why, but
Hmm.
be open-minded to be comfortable with sitting in cognitive dissonance. I think academic training does teach you that, to be very
Yes.
comfortable sitting in the
Yeah.
uncomfortable, um,
Yeah.
and
You
then
get
just
very,
moving.
like when you're in academia, you get very humbled as well. Like I
Yes.
find like you're like, oh wow. So like I remember like during the first semester, I was like, I don't know anything. Like I don't
Yep.
even know what I don't even know. Like
Hmm.
I like, and people don't realize that like that's like the most valuable lesson that you learn when you're getting these like professional degrees or like graduate school is like you learn like I know a lot about this one thing, but that
Hmm.
doesn't make me like I don't know. There's lots of things that I don't know, right? And people expect you to know lots, and so then you get these people that take these courses, and then it's like,
Hmm.
well, if I'm comfortable knowing that I know so little, why are these people so confident? And then they get that
It's that
Dunning-Kruger
Dunning-Kruger
thing.
effect,
Yeah.
yeah, where they get a little bit of information makes them dangerous because they don't see,
Yeah.
they don't see the iceberg, right? Like they don't see how much
No.
further it goes down beneath the surface. They just see above the surface and think, oh,
Yes.
I conquered this iceberg, and they don't realize how much has
Yeah.
gone below. And they think that they're, so again, these certifications of these blank blank
Yeah.
certified blank blanks think,
Hmm.
oh yeah, and they're told like, oh, carbs and
No.
kibble,
They're just
horrible.
regurgitating.
They're regurgitating. That's exactly what they're
Yeah.
doing. They're regurgitating. They're not thinking about it, and
Hmm.
it's not doing anybody any favors because then it
No.
looks convincing and it's flashy and it's clickbait, and pet guardians fall for it. But hopefully, just
Yeah.
by doing what you're doing, you can
Yeah,
just help
hopefully.
get good
Yeah.
information out there and help people stop falling prey to that level of misinformation. Or my
Yeah.
goal is even just to have them questioned a little bit before they're like,
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
like let's jump into this echo chamber and believe all the nonsense. Like just at least, even if they just pause and they're like,
Hmm.
or when they see an ad from a pet food company
Oh
and
yeah.
saying that they don't have any synthetics, and then you're like, actually, there's 4 synthetics right there.
Yes, yeah, I
Or
saw you posted something about that, and I was like, oh, like, yeah, it's just the gall of some company, and then people believe it, and
yep.
I tell like a lot of clients or people who've messaged me, I'm like, if you have a question, like if you see an ad or something, don't hesitate to message me on Instagram, and that goes the same for people that are listening. Like, I'm generally pretty reasonable to like answer and talk about things if they've got questions because I just kind of want to share like the science and the learning. And I think that's the most important thing, is to get
Yeah. Or the
people
greenwashing,
informed.
because that's confusing
Yes.
for people. Is like when a
Oh yeah.
company will throw up a research study and
Yeah.
I have to do a post on it. It's like cats and a vegan diet. And it was like
Oh
a
yeah.
very,
Yeah.
very respected researcher who I like adore. I think he's the world
Mhm.
of this individual. And
Mhm.
it was like, oh, this diet, vegan diet is perfectly fine and okay and totally safe. And I'm like,
Yeah.
no, like this
Yeah.
one study is not enough. We need some
No.
longer term data on these
Yeah.
very new and novel ingredients feeding facultative and obligate
Y-
carnivores, preferential
yeah.
carnivores, no meat at all. We need a
No.
little bit more longevity
Yeah.
in the research to before we can say that. So just teaching people like, oh, you can't just grab a study and a pet food
No.
company shouldn't just be like throwing one study at you of like, here,
Yeah.
this, that, and that. And like, no, that's
Yeah.
actually not what the study even said to begin with. Sometimes it's like, that's not even what that study said. They just like listed
No.
it.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
can't just draw these overarching conclusions from even these two or
One
three
thing.
studies that, yeah, one thing
Yeah.
or two or three things, it's just
Yeah.
inaccurate. So,
Yeah.
yeah. So, how
Mhm.
do our listeners find you? Like, where, if they want to, know more about you or interact with you
Um
or have a
uh,
consult with
y-
you, how do they find
yeah.
you?
On my Instagram, like Nibble Nutrition, they can message me, or my email, which is just www.nibblenutrition@outlook.com. Yeah. I also have a website, and it's Nibble Nutrition. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
excellent. Well, thank you so much for
Yeah.
being our guest
Yeah.
today,
Thanks for having me.
and it was so good to meet you. And hopefully, you'll
Yeah.
get to meet you in person and
Yeah.
someday,
Hopefully.
and
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
at
It
a
was nice
conference,
meeting you.
or if you ever, I
Yeah.
could maybe get a duet talk going. Like I want to change.